Around 2,200 years ago, the most powerful man on earth raised a small cup to his lips and drank his own death, believing it was the opposite. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unite China, a ruler so obsessed with living forever that he sent expeditions to the ends of the world to find the secret of immortality. And his court alchemists told him they had found it. They gave him pills and tonics containing a shining silvery liquid, a metal that flowed like water and seemed unmistakably alive. And they promised that swallowing it would make him a god who never died. So he drank it. Again and again, he was drinking the very substance that was killing him and calling it eternal life. This is the history of Mercury, the beautiful liquid metal that drove the world mad. To understand why an emperor would drink poison, you have to understand what Mercury looked like to the ancient world. Qin Shi Huang had done what no one before him managed. He had conquered the warring kingdoms and forged them into a single empire, standardized its writing, its coins, and its roads, and begun the first Great Wall. He had, in a sense, already achieved a kind of immortality, but it was not enough. He wanted the literal kind. He wanted to never die. His alchemists believed they could give it to him, and their reasoning, strange as it sounds, had a terrible logic. Mercury did not behave like other matter. It did not rust. It did not rot. It did not decay the way flesh and wood and iron decayed. It was liquid, and yet it was metal. It flowed and shimmered and seemed to renew itself endlessly, never tarnishing, never dying. To men searching for the secret of eternal life, a substance that appeared immune to death itself looked less like a poison and more like the answer. If you could take that incorruptibility into your own body, perhaps you too would never corrupt. So they prepared their elixirs, often combining mercury with other ingredients, and the emperor swallowed them. And according to the ancient accounts, the results were exactly what you would now predict. Mercury attacks the brain. Qin Shi Huang is said to have grown erratic, paranoid, and increasingly unstable in his final years, terrified of death and convinced of assassins behaving in ways that suggest a mind coming apart. The very treatment meant to preserve him was by many accounts poisoning him toward the grave. He died in the year 210 before the Common Era, while traveling far from his capital. And there is a grim detail even in his death. His officials, fearing the chaos that news of the emperor's death might unleash, are said to have concealed the body for the long journey home, disguising the smell of decay with carts of rotten fish. The man who drank a metal to escape decay was hidden behind rotting fish so that no one would know he had decayed. And then there is the tomb. Qin Shi Huang was buried in an enormous complex near what is now the city of Xi'an, the same site that would later yield the famous terracotta army, thousands of clay soldiers standing guard over him in death. But the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century afterward, described something stranger still at the heart of the tomb. He wrote that the emperor's burial chamber contained a model of his entire empire, with the great rivers and the sea recreated in flowing mercury, made to move mechanically, 100 rivers of liquid silver running through the dark. For a long time, that sounded like pure legend, but when modern researchers surveyed the soil above the still unexcavated burial mound, they reportedly found mercury concentrations far higher than in the surrounding land. The rivers of mercury may well be real. The emperor who drank the living metal to live forever lies, to this day, sealed inside a small poisoned sea of it. He is one of the first named victims in a story that would repeat, in one form or another, for the next 2,000 years. So what exactly was this substance that could fool an emperor into drinking it? To the ancient and medieval world, mercury was the single most magical material known, and it earned that reputation honestly, because there is genuinely nothing else like it. Every other metal you can name is a solid: iron, gold, copper, lead, silver. All of them sit still and hard at ordinary temperatures. Mercury does not. Mercury is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature, a heavy, mirror-bright fluid that pools and runs and races across a surface. Spill it, and it shatters into a scatter of tiny quivering beads that chase one another and merge back together as though they were drops of something alive. It is so dense that iron and even lead will float on top of it. It catches the light like a mirror. To people who had never seen anything like it, it did not look like a mineral pulled from the ground. It looked like a living thing. That is exactly what they called it. The common name quicksilver comes from an old meaning of the word quick, which did not mean fast but meant living. Quicksilver means the living silver, the metal that is alive. Its chemical symbol today is the letters H and G, which come from a Latin word borrowed from the Greek hydrargyrum, meaning water silver, the silver that is also water. And the element's proper name, Mercury, was taken from the Roman god Mercury, the winged, fleet-footed messenger of the gods, because nothing else on Earth moved the way this liquid did. To the alchemists, this made Mercury the most important substance in the universe. Many of them believed it was the prima materia, the first matter, the fundamental stuff from which all other metals were formed. If you could only master it, they thought, you could turn lead into gold, cure any disease, and unlock eternal life itself. For well over 1,000 years, Mercury sat at the very center of the alchemist's craft, distilled and heated, and combined in 10,000 experiments across China, the Islamic world, and Europe. By the brilliant and the deluded alike, all of them convinced they were handling the key to creation. In their theory, every metal in the ground was a blend of two principles, mercury and sulfur, and gold was simply the most perfect balance of the two. Get the mixture right, tame and fix the restless quicksilver into a stable, perfect form, and base metal would ripen into gold the way fruit ripens on a tree. They never managed it, of course. But in chasing that impossible dream, generation after generation, they handled the metal endlessly and paid for it with their bodies, without ever once suspecting the connection. And here is where the shadow first falls across the story quietly, the way it always does. Because the people who worked most closely with this magical metal, the alchemists bent over their furnaces and the miners who dug it out of the ground, tended to share a strange set of afflictions that nobody, for the longest time, connected to the metal itself. Their hands began to shake with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. Their gums softened and their teeth loosened and fell out. Some grew strangely timid and fearful. Others turned irritable and paranoid, their personalities curdling in ways their families could not explain. They were being poisoned, slowly, through their skin and their lungs, their nervous systems eroding a little more with every year of exposure. But nobody read the warning. How could they? This was the metal of immortality, the master substance of the alchemists, the living silver that was going to unlock the secrets of the world. The idea that it was the very thing shaking these men to pieces and hollowing out their minds was, to that world, almost unthinkable. And so the beautiful liquid went on being handled and admired and swallowed, century after century, while the men closest to it quietly came apart. The warning had been written from the very beginning. It would take 2,000 years to be believed. Nowhere was that slow poisoning more concentrated or more deliberate than in a single place in central Spain, the mines of Almadén. The name Almadén comes from an Arabic word meaning simply the mine, and it sat atop the richest deposit of mercury or the world has ever known. The ore is called cinnabar, a heavy red rock, and locked inside it is mercury. Almadén was worked for roughly 2,000 years, from Roman times onward, and over the centuries it produced a staggering share of all the mercury humanity has ever used. But it was under Spanish rule, especially from the 1500s onward, that Almadén became something close to hell on earth. The reason was economics, and it ties mercury to one of the great engines of the age. When Spain conquered the Americas and found mountains of silver, it needed a way to extract that silver from crushed ore. And the method it came to rely on used mercury to bind the silver and pull it free. Mercury, in other words, was what turned New World rock into Spanish wealth. Almadén, together with a second terrible mine called Huancavelica, high in the mountains of Peru, supplied that mercury. The empire ran on it, and the crown needed men to dig it. So it used the men it considered expendable, convicts, enslaved people, prisoners. A sentence to labor in the mercury mines of Almadén was, everyone understood, effectively a death sentence, only a slow one. Men were sent down into the hot, cramped tunnels to hack out the cinnabar and to tend the furnaces where it was roasted to drive the mercury out as vapor. And that vapor was the deadliest part of all. An invisible poison they breathed shift after shift. The effects were unmistakable and horrifying. The miners began to salivate uncontrollably, their mouths producing so much saliva that they could not stop drooling, a classic sign of mercury poisoning. Their gums blackened, and their teeth dropped out. Their limbs shook with the mercurial tremor until some could no longer hold a tool or raise a cup to their mouths without spilling it. And their minds went. They grew fearful, confused, and unstable, some sliding into a condition indistinguishable from madness. Men sent to Almadén came out, if they came out at all, trembling, toothless, and broken, often within just a few years. It is worth pausing on what that means, because it is the same pattern as the emperor and the alchemists, only now industrialized, deliberate, and enormous. This was not a handful of scholars accidentally poisoning themselves at a furnace. This was a system run for profit by one of the most powerful empires in history that knowingly fed human beings into a poison because their suffering was cheaper than the alternative. The tremoring alchemists of the ancient world had been a whisper of warning. Almadén was a scream. And still, the wider world did not draw the obvious conclusion because mercury was too useful, too valuable, too woven into the machinery of wealth to give up. In fact, at the very same time these men were dying in the tunnels, the same metal was being handed to the sick as a cure. Because for a long stretch of history, mercury was not only a poison people feared, it was a medicine people trusted. And that is one of the darkest ironies in the whole story. The most notorious example was the treatment of syphilis. When that disease swept through Europe from the end of the 1400s, it was terrifying, disfiguring, and often fatal, and physicians reached for the most powerful substance they knew. They reached for mercury. Patients were given mercury to swallow, mercury ointments to rub into their skin, and were even shut inside heated boxes filled with mercury vapor to breathe. And the sign that the treatment was working, doctors believed, was when the patient began to salivate, drooling pints of saliva a day, the very same symptom that had marked the dying miners of Almadén as poisoned. Doctors thought they were driving the disease out of the body. What they were often doing was poisoning the patient alongside the illness. So many people endured this that it produced a grim proverb that lasted for centuries: a night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. One night of pleasure, a lifetime of the cure. Some patients no doubt improved or seemed to, because syphilis has stages that come and go on their own. But many were slowly destroyed by the very treatment meant to save them, dying of the mercury rather than the disease. For nearly 400 years, until safer treatments finally arrived in the 20th century, mercury remained a standard weapon against syphilis, a cure that was frequently indistinguishable from a slow killing, and it did not stop with adults. Mercury worked its way into the ordinary family medicine cabinet, into remedies given to the most vulnerable people of all. A compound of mercury called calomel was used as a general-purpose medicine for all manner of ailments. And, most heartbreakingly, it was put into teething powders for babies. These were sold as gentle, soothing remedies rubbed onto the gums of infants across the Victorian world and well into the 20th century to calm a crying, teething child. They were poisoning children. The result was a condition that came to be called pink disease, for one of its most visible signs. Affected babies and toddlers, slowly poisoned by the mercury in their powders, developed hands and feet that turned raw and pink and painfully swollen, almost as though burned. They became miserable, sleepless, and wasted, their hair falling out, their small bodies in constant pain. Many died. And it took an astonishingly long time deep into the 20th century before doctors finally traced the cause back to the mercury in the powders that loving parents had been giving their own children to help them. So here, at last, the loop planted at the very beginning closes, and it closes with a terrible clarity. The tremoring alchemists, the shaking miners, the drooling patients, the poisoned infants, all of them were showing the same signs, the same slow unraveling caused by the same beautiful metal. The warning had been written on human bodies for 2,000 years, but because mercury was believed to be medicine, believed to be magic, believed to be valuable, the world kept reading those broken bodies as anything at all except what they actually were. And the strangest chapter of that willful blindness was about to hand the English language one of its most familiar phrases. That phrase is mad as a hatter, and almost everyone has heard it. Most people assume it is just a bit of colorful nonsense, or that it comes from Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. But the phrase is older than the book, and it was not nonsense at all. It was the description of a real, widespread, and devastating occupational disease. Hatters truly did go mad, and it was mercury that did it to them. The cause was hiding inside the making of an ordinary felt hat. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the finest felt was made from animal fur, often rabbit, and to turn that fur into good felt, it first had to be treated with a solution containing mercury. The process was called carroting, because the mercury solution stained the fur an orange tinge, and it made the fibers rough up and mat together into dense, workable felt, far better than untreated fur ever could. It was, from a hat maker's point of view, a genuinely useful trick. It made better hats faster, but it filled the workshops with mercury. As the treated fur was dried, shaved, shaped with heat and steam, and worked into hats, it released mercury vapor into the air, and the hatters breathed it in. They worked long hours, often in small, hot, poorly ventilated rooms, day after day, year after year, in a fog of invisible poison. And slowly, the mercury took them apart, in the exact way it had taken the miners and the alchemists, except now the world could watch it happen inside an ordinary trade in an ordinary town. First came the tremor. A hatter's hands would begin to shake, a trembling that grew until it could become violent, so that the man's whole body seemed to shudder. It was so common, it had its own name, the hatter's shakes. And in the great American hat-making town of Danbury in Connecticut, it was known simply as the Danbury Shakes. A skilled craftsman would slowly lose the ability to do the fine work his trade required, his hands betraying him a little more with each passing year. But it was what mercury did to the mind that gave the disease its lasting name. Beyond the tremor, the poisoned hatters underwent a slow and frightening change of personality. Many became painfully, cripplingly shy, so anxious and self-conscious that they could not bear to be watched, growing flustered and distressed if a stranger entered the room. Others became irritable, quarrelsome, and paranoid, prone to sudden outbursts of temper or fits of weeping, suspicious of the people around them, withdrawing from the world. Their memory failed, their confidence collapsed. To an outside observer who did not understand the cause, a man in the grip of it could look, quite simply, as though he were losing his mind. And that is precisely how society chose to see it. Not as a poisoning, as a madness, as a joke. The trembling, timid, unpredictable hatter became a stock figure, a familiar type, someone to be laughed at or pitied. The condition even had a proper medical description. Doctors of the era wrote about the strange nervous symptoms of hatters, this combination of tremor and shyness and irritability that we now recognize as classic mercury poisoning of the brain, a syndrome sometimes called erethism. It was documented, it was known, and still the common understanding of it settled into a nursery rhyme phrase, a bit of whimsy: mad as a hatter. When Lewis Carroll published his Mad Hatter in the 1860s, a giggling, riddling, unstable character at a nonsensical tea party, he was drawing, whether he fully intended it or not, on a figure his readers already recognized, the hatter whose mind had come undone. Generations of children have laughed at that character, without ever knowing that behind the funny hat and the strange behavior was a real class of working men whose nervous systems had been eaten away by the poison of their trade. The whimsy was built on a wound. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Even after the cause was understood, even after doctors could point to the mercury and explain exactly what it was doing to these men, the practice continued for decades. Carroting with mercury remained the standard way to make felt hats, and hatters kept breathing the vapor and kept falling ill generation after generation because it worked and because changing it cost money. In the United States, mercury was not removed from the hat-making process until the year 1941. And even then, by many accounts, the final push had less to do with saving the hatters than with the fact that mercury had suddenly become valuable elsewhere. Men had been visibly losing their minds to this trade for over a century before it was finally stopped. So mercury had now claimed emperors chasing eternity, miners fed to an empire's furnaces, patients seeking a cure, infants in their cradles, and craftsmen at their benches. And across all of it, the world had found ways to explain away the bodies, to call the suffering fate, or disease, or madness, or simply a funny saying about hats. But the 20th century was about to deliver a disaster so concentrated, so visible, and so undeniable that it could no longer be looked away from. It happened in a quiet fishing town on the coast of Japan. The town was called Minamata, on the western coast of the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. It was a fishing community built around a bay whose waters had fed local families for generations. It was also home to a large chemical factory run by a company called Chiso, one of the most important employers in the entire region. For decades, that factory had been releasing its industrial wastewater directly into the sea. Among the waste was mercury, a byproduct of the chemicals the plant produced, and in the water that mercury underwent a crucial and terrible change. Bacteria in the sediment converted it into a form called methylmercury, an organic compound that living tissue absorbs far more readily than raw metallic mercury, and that passes with cruel ease into the brain and across the barrier of the womb. The methylmercury entered the food chain. It was taken up by tiny organisms, which were eaten by small fish, which were eaten by larger fish. And at each step it concentrated, building to higher and higher levels in the flesh of the fish and shellfish of Minamata Bay, the very fish the town lived on. The people of Minamata were, without any warning at all, being fed a slow accumulating dose of one of the most potent nerve poisons known. The first signs, by many accounts, appeared in the animals. Cats in the fishing villages began to convulse and stagger, moving in strange lurching spasms that locals called the dancing cat disease, some of them hurling themselves into the sea. Birds fell out of the sky, and then in the year 1956, it appeared in people. Patients arrived with slurring speech, with numbness in their hands and feet, with a stumbling, uncontrolled walk. Their vision narrowed. Some lost the ability to speak or swallow, convulsed, and fell into comas. Some died. But the cruelest dimension of the Minamata disaster is almost unbearable to state plainly, so I will simply state it. Mothers who ate the fish, and who themselves showed only mild symptoms, or sometimes none at all, gave birth to babies who had been poisoned in the womb. These children were born with severe permanent damage, unable to move or speak normally, harmed in body and mind before they had ever taken a breath. The mercury had reached them through their mothers across the placenta, and it had taken from them a life they had not yet begun to live. And for years, the suffering was denied. The company and the authorities were slow to accept the cause, slow to stop the dumping, slow to acknowledge what the fish were doing to the people who ate them. The pollution is understood to have continued for years after the disease was first identified, while families sickened and fought simply to be believed and to be compensated. Thousands of people were eventually recognized as victims, and by some counts, the dead numbered well over 1,000, though the true toll is debated and may be far higher, because a poisoning like this hides inside symptoms that can be blamed on other things. Minamata became a byword, the name of a disease and the name of a warning, the moment the modern world finally could not look away from what mercury does. For a long time, Minamata felt like a horror belonging to one town. It was not. It was simply the clearest view the world had yet been given of a poison it had been living with all along. And slowly, that recognition began to change things. Nations began to restrict mercury, to control how it was used and released, to phase it out of the countless products it had quietly occupied. That effort reached a milestone in the year 2013, when countries from around the world adopted an international treaty to cut mercury pollution and protect people from it. They named it deliberately after the town that had shown the world the cost. They called it the Minamata Convention. A fishing town's grief became the name of a global promise. But Mercury has not left us. It is still here, still doing exactly what it has always done. The single largest source of mercury pollution in the world today is not some relic of the past. It is small-scale gold mining, practiced across parts of the Amazon, Africa, and Asia, where miners use raw mercury to pull gold out of crushed ore, almost exactly as the Spanish Empire once did, and in doing so poison themselves and the rivers they work, sending mercury into the fish and into people far downstream, right now today. It is why pregnant women are still warned in wealthy modern countries to limit how much of certain fish they eat, because the methyl mercury that devastated Minamata is present, in smaller amounts, in the tuna and swordfish of an ordinary supermarket. And it sits still in the mouths of millions of older people in the silver-colored dental fillings that are roughly half mercury by weight. And that is only what remains. For most of the last few centuries, mercury was simply everywhere in ordinary life, so common that almost no one gave it a thought. It was the silver thread in the thermometer slipped under your tongue and in the barometer on the wall. It was the shining drop inside the thermostat and the switch, and the vapor inside the fluorescent tube overhead. And for hundreds of years it was in your mirror, because the finest mirrors were made by backing glass, with a thin skin of mercury and tin. A delicate craft whose workers breathed the fumes and suffered the very same tremors, timidity, and slow madness as the hatters. Mercury was never some exotic hazard locked safely away in a distant factory. It was in the home, in the bathroom cabinet, on the wall, in the mouth. It was quite literally under the tongue, so step back and look at the whole length of it. An emperor drank this metal to live forever, and it buried him in a poisoned tomb. Miners were fed to it by the thousands to enrich an empire. The sick were dosed with it as a cure and died of the cure. Babies were soothed with it and poisoned in their cradles. Hatters breathed it and lost their minds, and the world turned their agony into a joke. And a fishing town ate it in its fish and watched its children born broken. Through every one of those chapters across more than 2,000 years, the metal itself never changed at all. It never became more dangerous or less. It was always exactly what it had been in the Emperor's cup, a beautiful, heavy, shining liquid that beads and flows and splits and rejoins, and looks, more than anything else on Earth, like something alive. That was always the lie. It moved like something living. It was death the entire time. If this changed the way you think about the shining bead of metal in an old thermometer, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of Mercury's history disturbed you the most. And share this with someone who still believes they know what Quicksilver really is.